Hello and welcome to Rank and File Radio Prairie Edition on CKUW 95.9 FM, Canadian labour news and analysis across Manitoba, Saskatchewan and Alberta. This show is an independent partner with RankandFile.ca and supported by CKUW listeners, Patreon supporters, and UFCW Local 832. This episode is broadcasting from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Today's broadcast date is April 14th, 2019. I'm your host, Emily Leadham. Today on the show, Robert Lee, an industrial electrician based in Alberta who has spent the last several years working on and off in the oil sands. Workers in the oil and gas industry have been used as a talking point by the Alberta NDP and the United Conservative Party. Both parties say they are the best choice for workers to get the Trans Mountain Pipeline built and create more jobs in the industry. Albertans go to the polls on Tuesday, April 16th. But energy and climate experts say that no government will be able to revive Alberta's oil boom. The energy economy has simply changed too much. Not only is there a slow but steady shift towards renewable energy, according to London-based researcher Andrew Grant speaking to the Canadian press, companies are increasingly reluctant to invest capital in projects that require very, very high capital outlay and take years and years to pay back. That encapsulates the oil sands. Mark Jacquard, an energy economist at BC's Simon Fraser University, who has advised governments on climate policy and helps write reports for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says, "No policy of any Albertan government can change things. When the global demand for oil stabilizes and starts to fall, Alberta will be hit first," he said. "The oil sands are among the highest emissions per barrel with the highest production costs." Jacquard says there has also been a steady decline in oil sands jobs. Between 2014 and 2016, production grew by nearly 10%, but 39,000 fewer people were employed. Albertan oil input increased over the last 4 years while the jobs were lost, he said. Despite this, oil sands companies have remained incredibly profitable over the past several years, according to Ian Hussey, lead author of a recent report released by the Parkland Institute and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Despite the 2014 oil price crash and the ongoing hand-wringing over pipelines and the price differential, the reality is that the big five oil sands producers have remained incredibly profitable corporations, he told CBC. Last year alone, the companies banked or paid out to shareholders a total of $13.5 billion. These companies have been able to continue to transfer sizable amounts of money to their shareholders or to their bank accounts, while at the same time in 2015, cutting almost 20,000 jobs from the Alberta economy, he said. This has wreaked havoc in Alberta's social fabric. 2015 saw a spike in the suicide rate following the layoffs. David Kirby, a counsellor with the Calgary Distress Centre, said demand for counselling increased by 80% in 2015, and the problems people are struggling with were more complex. There might be substance abuse issues. There might be imminent financial collapse, he said. Anxiety, depression, relationship conflict, maybe concurrent domestic violence. So there are many more things that people are trying to juggle, I think, all at the same time. And the Globe and Mail recently reported nearly 2 Albertans are now dying every day from an accidental fentanyl overdose, according to new data from the provincial government that show fatalities from the misuse of opioids hit a record high in 2018. There is a lot of real anger and frustration in Alberta right now, and those emotions are ripe to be taken advantage of by politicians promising cures for people's pain. The Trans Mountain Pipeline has become a short-sighted symbol of restoring jobs and stability to Albertans' lives. A lot of Albertans' anger and frustration is being channeled away from actual corporations that are taking advantage of Alberta's workers without investing their massive profits back into the province. James Wilt reported for the Narwhal, "The companies producing that oil, including Suncor, Cenovus, Canadian Natural Resources Limited, and Imperial Oil, made $10.14 billion in profits in 2017, while Albertans collected $2.37 billion in royalties. That means the biggest oil sands companies paid a total royalty rate of 23.37% of profits. That pales in comparison to corporate tax rates on oil producers around the world. Saudi Arabia has 85%, Norway 78%, China 63.5%, and Australia at 58%. He writes, if Alberta applied a flat 78% rate to profits generated by the top 30 oil sands projects, it theoretically would have collected $7.91 billion in 2017, $5.54 billion more than it did. Instead of taking a critical look at corporate agendas and profit motives, right-wing organizers like the Rebel Media, the Yellow Vest Movement, and the United We Roll Convoy have stoked fears about immigration and, quote, migrants stealing jobs, drumming up anger over the UN Migration Compact. It's a classic divide-and-conquer tactic to get workers fighting each other, while corporations continue to be let off the hook. And throughout all this corporate and political propaganda, we rarely hear from actual workers. Last week, I talked to Marco Luciano, director of Migrante Alberta. He supports migrants working in the service industry and as caregivers in Fort McMurray. He talked about the importance of building solidarity among migrant and non-migrant workers. They are currently fundraising for a migrant workers center, which you can learn more about by contacting them at migrantealberta.ca. And last year on the show, I talked to Angel Aluk, an Indigenous researcher with the Alberta Union of Public Employees, about how women and Indigenous workers are employed in the oil sands. The people who work and have worked in the oil patch are diverse and complex and not unanimous in their political opinions. If we are to organize for a just transition away from fossil fuels, we must listen and understand why workers end up in the patch in the first place. If we are to hold these corporations accountable to pay higher taxes, to create green jobs cleaning up oil wells, doing environmental restoration, building wind and solar facilities, developing robust public transit, and retrofitting infrastructure for extreme weather conditions, we'll need the power of labor. Which brings me to my interview with Robert Lee. He's an industrial electrician and oilfield automation programmer from Blackie, Alberta. He also teaches drop-in classes on handyman and home renovation topics for several continuing education facilities in Calgary. He's a married father of 2 and has worked as an electrician for 13 years and was one of the first people in Canada to be CSA certified in solar power installation. He has worked on and off in the oil sands and provides a bit of a window into the realities of working in the patch and why strong unions and labor standards matter for oil patch workers, and the challenges involved in building solidarity between migrant and non-migrant workers. So yeah, I guess to start off, we'll talk about what kind of work have you done in the oil sands?
So I've been working up there off and on since about, since 2012. And I've done both unionized and non-unionized work. So the first time I went up there was doing electrical and automation for some of the smaller and larger gas plants. And then I wound up for a couple years being up there as a oilfield electrician on new construction projects around there. The last few times I've been up was for an automation company again. So it's mainly electrical and automation.
And what is union density like up there?
It's actually really hard to tell while you're up there, because when you're up there as a unionized employee, they pretty much just keep you with the other unionized employees. And then when you're going up there for a non-unionized company or just as a contractor, you're pretty much only working with the other non-unionized people or contractors. From what I can tell going up, like when I was up as a non-unionized person, you'd think that there wasn't any unions up there. And then when you're up there as a union, it looks like that's what everybody is. So I don't know the exact statistics, and I don't. It's hard to tell just from being up there, weirdly enough.
So working and living up in Fort Mac has a reputation of being incredibly tough, but you get paid extremely well for your troubles. What are working and living conditions like, and is the paycheck always worth it?
The paycheck is worth it, but you kind of have to set up, I guess, a plan for yourself to get in and get out. Otherwise, you become a lifer. When I've been up there as a unionized employee, I was always put up in camps. So you're talking like you're being given a little room. You can touch both walls at the same time, way out in the middle of the woods, and you're basically at work 24/7 for however long your rotation is. So like 2 or 3 weeks at a time. So that gets very, I don't know, that gets long. It's pretty overwhelming when you first do it. I think the first 3 or 4 weeks that I was up there as a unionized employee, working or living in a camp, and then being at work every day for, I think my first rotation was 3 weeks at a time. That was rough. I think that's one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. You get used to it, but getting used to it is very difficult. When I've been up non-union or as a contractor, usually you won't be put out in the oil field itself for staying. You'll be given a hotel, or sometimes a company will have a condo in town, and that's where you'll be staying. And that is honestly kind of rougher, because when you're not out at this camp with your coworkers, you're just kind of in a hotel room by yourself for weeks at a time. So I don't know, I guess it depends a lot on how you can handle something like that. I found it very lonely until I got used to it.
Yeah, you mentioned it can be extremely challenging to be up there for that long stretch of time, and I imagine you're working super long hours as well, so you're kind of
yeah 12 hours a day for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. You're always working. Like, you don't have time to do anything else. You get up and you're at camp. You eat, you go to work, you come back, you're at camp, and you go to bed. That's like, there's no escaping it.
What does that have an impact on, I guess, just mental health, being able to communicate with loved ones who live not where you are, and I guess the kind of culture up there that, I guess, how does that impact your overall mental health?
It was terrible for mine. So because when you're working, you're way out, like, I know it's kind of like an industrial area that you're working in, but you're off in the woods, and like for the most part, there's no, or at least limited cell service. So you don't really get to talk to anybody except for when you're at your camp. You can call home for like the last couple hours of the day. I don't know. It depends a lot on where you go. There's so there's 2 different types of camps that you can go there. You can go for a wet camp or a dry camp, and that just means whether or not you're allowed to have alcohol at the camp or not. And I was always lucky enough to be put at one that had a bar. And once you've been up there for weeks at a time and you haven't really had the chance to talk to anybody for a while, and you're getting lonely, it's real easy to start going to the bar like every night. And it's pretty similar when you're up there as a non-unionized employee as well. When you're in town and you don't really have anything to do, you're bored, it's pretty easy to pick up a couple of vices. And I think it's actually worse at the dry camps, because everyone still needs their vices up there after they've been up there for a while. So that's when people really start getting into drugs, especially because it's a lot easier to, sneak drugs into the camp and stuff. Yeah, it's really easy to get into a depressive streak, and it's really easy to pick up a couple of really bad habits. So I was lucky I got out okay, but I know a lot of guys that have been working up there for their entire lives, and you just get into a really bad spot. So I don't know. Me and my wife both we came up with a plan to get in, make some money, and get out. And I think that's pretty well what you have to do if you're planning on going up there for work.
Occupational health and safety must be a huge thing up there, and I have heard anecdotal stories that just sound horrifying to me. And it must be, an experience knowing that there is or could be a potential of a really bad accident happening. I guess would you be able to speak to a bit of your experience there and how OHS was handled?
Well, any of the sites that I've worked on up there, I always managed to get onto the safety committees. So I did have a pretty good idea of what was going on for all that. And I was lucky enough to never work at a site where somebody died like while I was there. But there's a really brutal stretch in 2013 or 2014 where there was somebody dying at the Syncrude site every couple of weeks. And whenever that would happen, like there'd be basically a safety shutdown on our site, and like there'd be like a moment of silence for the people in the morning, lots of training on preventing on whatever happened from happening again. It's actually one of the places I've seen like OH&S, the safety departments, like actually like react to stuff immediately, which is nice. But I mean, that's always kind of on your mind there. It's very, very dangerous work. I think I was telling you, you're out in the woods, like you have like bears walking in all the time, and you're very, very far away from any sort of help that can get to you. I think for the most part, people look out for themselves there more than they do other places, because it's kind of always on your mind that like if something goes wrong, it's going like catastrophically wrong. Like there's no minor injuries up there. You're either doing good or you're dead. I mean, I spent like weeks working on this one piece of equipment, and then somebody at a different site, it was reported that somebody at a different site died like working on it, this exact same piece of equipment that I'd been working on for weeks. And so like that very quickly changed the way I was working. Just going back to OH&S, like people had a lot more understanding of I guess specific OH&S policy up there, and any sort of government attempts to change wording to policy and stuff. People are a lot more astute up there than I think they're really given credit for. While I was up there, there was a lot of battle over changing the wording of the responsibility to refuse safe work to the right to refuse safe work, because that was something that had the potential to change if you were hurt at work, whether or not you were able to get any sort of like compensation or EI. And I think just having that hanging over your head all day, every day, just really, you have to pay attention to that. People would get quite up in arms about that. And like people you'd see who would have typically very conservative social views would be voting against the conservatives, because the conservatives would be trying to, change legislation that would, prevent them from getting EI in case of an injury. You never hear about that working like non-union, but when you do work union, like you're getting updated all the time on what's going on with that. Maybe I can bring that back to something that's happening right now. So one of the big projects that's happening right now up there is they're widening the highway going to Fort McMurray. And that was something that the unions had been fighting for a very, very long time and got absolutely nowhere with for the longest time. But pretty well every time you'd go back to work, you'd hear stories about like who from what site had gotten killed on the highway driving. This thing was always there, like, why aren't they widening the roads? And so the way things are built up there, things aren't just like, they don't open up like a construction site like you would here and just start, digging and putting stuff in the road and building stuff like a building you would here. The way things are done there, it's modular building. So there's sites all over Calgary and Edmonton and Red Deer and I think Lethbridge. Some union, some not. And they build part of a building or something that can fit onto the back of a flatbed truck. Basically, the construction sites are sent up there on the back of a truck on this single lane highway. When all these things are delivered, basically they stack up all these modular pieces of buildings on top of each other and beside each other. And when you're up there as a tradesman, you're basically putting Lego blocks together. And like, I don't know, if you go up there and you look at the weird dimensions of the buildings, that's why. It's because everything was shipped up there on the back of a truck and truck-sized chunks. That's one way that they got around the huge cost of building things up there. But because they were shipping the stuff up and down on the road, and it was a single-lane highway, you'd have all these people that were just trying to like get to work or get home at the end of like a 21-day rotation. They're tired on the road and they're trying to, pass them everything. And you've got like basically entire construction sites like being driven up the road. It's like just something small like them riding the highway is going to, I don't know. I'm pretty sure somebody died up there like every week while I was working up there. And like if that can, if projects like that can like save lives like that, then I don't know. I think that's the kind of positive thing that like the NDP really needs to keep doing up there to keep people on their side and voting for them. But unfortunately, not a lot of that really makes it down to anywhere else outside of Fort McMurray and the immediate oil sands. So I don't know. There's been lots of awesome stuff like that happening, and I don't know how much of that really kind of gets out.
What are some of the benefits in working for a unionized versus a non-unionized employer? What were some of the main differences that you noticed?
First off, with the union, there's a camaraderie there that you don't really get anywhere else. But the one thing that I really noticed is that the unionized people had a lot more. You develop a class consciousness up there when you're basically you're stuck out in the middle of the woods and there's no real way to get home, and you're negotiating with your employer for some really, really basic stuff. I remember one of the things our union had to argue or had to negotiate for was flush toilets on our site. When you're having to deal with that day in, day out, you really, no matter who you are and wherever you fall on, I guess, like the political spectrum, you really start developing this a class consciousness based on more like total necessity. So one of the things that really won me over to the union side after I'd gone up there and had been working for a couple months was if people didn't get paid. If you get paid every Friday and you get your pay stub, but if there was a single unionized employee anywhere on any site for any specific company, if somebody didn't get their pay stub, nobody went to work. So it didn't matter like if it was a totally different union or who it was or whether you liked them or not. It was one person doesn't get paid, nobody's going to work. And that was really nice to see. And I don't know, after working non-union after I came back, that's probably the thing I missed the most. That was really awesome to see. That's one of the few times like in my career that I've, you get to really feel powerful, like you're making a difference. Then you start to realize that all these people that have maybe some very right-wing, even like anti-union views start developing this class consciousness that was really, really fascinating to see.
You talked about how one thing you had to negotiate when you were with a union was flush toilets, and that, to me, when you talk about, the conditions are rough, but you get paid really well. And so it's like, are you getting paid all the money so that once you leave the site, you can live in comfort? But when you're at the site, like, there's just not really very many luxuries, like, at all. Like, they're not really... I'm just interested in that aspect.
Yeah, well, one of the things that really helped me get through it is that the goal me and my wife had was we wanted to buy a house. And it's really expensive in Alberta if you don't work in the oil industry. So it's like, okay, we got to go up, and as rough as it is, a lot of the times when we talked, she basically had to keep reminding me of that to get me to stay through some of the rougher periods, especially like when I first went up there, and you just get totally overwhelmed with the roughness of it and the isolation, and she's like, I don't want this, I want to go home. Then just having someone being able to say, like, just tough it out for however long and you can get, we can make something happen. Now I've got a little house. So the toilet thing, though, that was one of the things. Your working conditions get negotiated a lot more often up there, and because you're so completely isolated, your employer has quite a bit more leverage at the bargaining table than you do at say a job in a city or close to your home. So one of the things that they kept bringing up was we had little flush toilet trailers all over our work site. And one of the things they wanted to do is they wanted to replace them all with outhouses and then like the antiseptic gel instead of running water. That was one of the things that our union had to go and argue for us, and we had to give up some other stuff in order to keep our toilets. It's a really bizarre position to be in, where it's like, okay, do I want overtime that'll help me, later, or do I want flush toilets that'll give me a little bit of dignity now? It's very, very. I don't know how you can't go up there and come away like with the idea that unions are necessary. Yeah, like I said, when I went up there, I was anti-union. I listened to all the anti-union talk here, and then just seeing that and getting to experience it firsthand, and having someone literally threatening to take away my toilet was like, oh, okay, I get it now.
Right, right. So, looking at the broader political landscape, oil sands jobs, pipeline jobs, jobs in those fields, and workers in those fields are a political talking point right now that the Alberta NDP and the UCP are sort of batting around like they're each going to be the best party for workers up in the oil sands or protecting oil and gas jobs. The Alberta NDP has run a campaign called Keep Canada Working as a means to promote building the Trans Mountain Pipeline. At the same time, many Indigenous and climate justice groups are calling for a just transition away from fossil fuels so we can mitigate the worst impacts of climate change and create green jobs. I guess this might be like a loaded question that we can unpack a little more, but first of all, if these jobs were available, how transferable do you feel like your skills would be to other greener industries like cleaning up oil wells or solar or wind projects?
That's actually a really sore sticking point whenever I hear people talking about that. You're hearing that quite a bit with like the NDP trying to clean up and eliminate coal in Alberta, and the UCP coming out with, we got to get the coal miners back to work. And it was the same thing with us. Like, we got to get the, I guess it wasn't really a rig, it was all mining up there, but we got to get us all back in the mines. But I think when people think about mining, they have this like romanticized version of it, like a miner like going into a hole in the ground with a pickaxe or something. But like, that's not what it is at all. It's a whole bunch of trades. Like, you can be like, I'm an industrial electrician, but like at the end of the day, I'm an electrician. I can go wire up houses or do whatever. Like, I don't need to be doing electrical in that one specific area. I've got skills that transfer very well over to solar or wind or anything else. And any other trade is like that. And I think it's kind of insulting to imply that, like, if you're, a coal miner, all you know how to do is mine coal, and all you know is mining coal. Like, that's what you like, and that's what you know how to do, and that's the end of it. But like, that's not true at all. Actually, while I was working up there was quite a bit of, I guess it was more rumors, but there was a lot of talk going around that there was going to be some large-scale solar going in Alberta, which clearly never happened. But a lot of the people that I talked to up there were really excited about that, because, I mean, working in the oil field is great because you can make a lot of money. But under a union contract, like, if your union pays you so much an hour, no matter what job you're at, it doesn't matter if you go over to work at a solar plant versus some sort of oil processing facility. And guys were excited about that because it's cleaner work. It's less disgusting. You're not breathing in, fumes and getting weird greases and stuff all over you all the time. Like, I don't know. I think there's a lot more support for that than you would know talking to really anyone. I find that very disheartening, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, you talked about coal, and Alberta's phasing out coal and has created a transition program for coal workers to kind of get training in other industries. Not that, you know, they would always need training, like you said, but just like there's a pathway to help transition them out of that particular industry. And so, I mean, hypothetically, what might a successful transition program look like for oil sands workers?
You know, the unions that I worked for already had a bit of a program in place. They offered quite a bit of training, like above and beyond whatever your trade was, that they would offer at their different facilities. So, like, if you had a week off, you could go to whatever facility and get, you know, trained in something else. And I don't know if more of that was available to more people, like a lot of people would jump on that. I don't know. I guess I don't really know the specifics of how you would change the economy itself over from like oil to like clean tech or whatever, but there's really not all that much you'd have to do to get, you know, the trades working in oil to trades working on a solar plant. And I know clearly not all of them would, but a lot of them would like it.
So like there would be less resistance than you might think from actual workers to transitioning to a different industry, just if the pathways and options and pay was available.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of the worry for people up there is the reason you go up there is to make that money. So like if you're up there for 3 weeks at a time, you're just there to make your money. You want to put on, you know, as much overtime as you can and work every single day possible so you can go home and have your money. And I think a lot of the worry is that if we transition to something else, you're not going to have jobs that pay like that. Because it's very hard, oddly, to make money in the trades in Alberta unless you're doing something related to oil and gas. So if you could keep the pay structure and the pay rates, I think people would be a lot more open to that. Because like the not private sector, the non-unionized sector, your pay is all over the place. I know I was really disheartened after I came back from one of my union jobs, is I tried to get a similar job in rural Alberta at a doing very similar electrical work for a non-unionized company, and it would be over a 50% pay cut. And if you're talking about that, it's really hard to get anybody to sign on board with that. Like, why would you do that? No one's going to take a 50% pay cut for any reason if you got a, you know, family to feed or whatever. But if you had the system in place that you could, you know, keep making your money, I guess as long as we're doing wage labor, is if you can keep making that kind of money, people would be more than happy to transfer to whatever. And people love to work places that are more clean. Like, obviously not everybody, but I sure did.
Yeah, this is so interesting, by the way, just hearing this, because I don't think you hear from workers straight up very often, or like there's maybe when you are hearing from workers, it's like it's presented as like a hegemony, right? Like all oil sands workers are, you know, on the United We Roll caravan. They're all are like up in arms, and you don't get the full complexity of who is all up there and what different kinds of jobs they're doing and why they're doing them. And it's a lot more diverse than what is being presented for like propaganda purposes, it feels like, during this election, you know?
You know what? I was never an NDP supporter until I went up to the oil sands and my coworkers there radicalized me. Like, there is massive NDP support up there just because they're the only ones that bring up unions in a positive light. So for a lot of the people up there, it's not what, you know, they're more than willing to look back or ignore any kind of like disagreements they may have on like social policy or something if the party that, you know, is letting us negotiate to keep our toilets is in power helping us. So the makeup up there is completely different from what you get just looking at it here. I was thinking about this today. Bernard the Roughneck. Do you remember him?
Yes.
So he's running as a politician in, I believe, Grand Prairie now, but like he was the guy that everybody trotted out. I think it was like 2016, and he turned out to be an actor, but he was what everybody thought that the worker up there looked like. He was a dirty looking early 30s white guy, and I'm not going to argue that that's not a good chunk of people up there, but anybody you can imagine is up there. It's people up there to make a buck. Like, I don't know. It's quite the disservice when people kind of depict it as this hegemonic, like white guy conservative stronghold. That's not true at all. I'd say probably half the people I worked up with there on electrical crews were probably Chinese. I've worked with handfuls of like gay and trans folks and stuff. Like there's everybody up there. It's not like it's just people up there. It's not what you see here.
Yeah, and that leads to my next question. There's been a lot of rhetoric around migrant workers, anti-migrant sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiment. Just last week, I talked to Marco Luciano, who's the director of Migrante Alberta, and he talked about how there are so many migrant workers up there working jobs like as nannies and working service jobs like at Tim Hortons. And so there's that whole kind of segment of the workforce that is up there as well. How do you think we can build better solidarity between higher paid oil sands workers and migrant workers and other low wage workers up there and throughout the province?
Well, part of the problem is that we were segregated. So like the people that were working in the towns, well, if you're up there as a unionized employee, you don't really get to town all that often. Like unless you drove up there or you want to take like a $90 cab ride, you're not getting into town and you're not getting to go interact with these people. So the migrant workers and the temporary foreign workers and stuff, you never really meet them. They're just this idea that's kind of out there to you that's being used as a cudgel by the media to try to I don't know, it's very hard for people to see the circumstances of like how and why those people are there, and that like they're not the bad guys. They're not the reason that the Canadians or whatever lost their job. It's not them that it's not their fault.
Well, yeah, I mean there's a lot to go into because there was like the downturn or whatever you call it, where a bunch of like oil workers were laid off, but at the same time it's like these companies were still making like massive profits. And I mean, migrant workers are invited to work very specific streams of work. So to say that someone coming up to Fort Mac to work Tim Hortons or work as a caregiver is like stealing that oil worker's job, it seems like a political rhetoric rather than reality.
Oh yeah, it was never the reality. Like, well, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. All the people that I talked to that were like that, the people that worked the service jobs in the city itself, they were like us. They had exit plans. Like they didn't want to be there forever. Lots of them were there while their families were other places, just so they could make enough money to go do something else. So like the migrant workers and the foreign workers, like that wasn't just a downturn thing. Like that was being pushed really hard during the up part of 2014 too. Like while oil and gas was at an all-time high and everybody was making money hand over fist. It definitely stoked some very bad feelings in a lot of the wrong kind of people. But I guess I don't really know what you'd do about that, or even how you'd begin bridging that.
Yeah, no, I mean there's no easy answers for sure. I think it's important and valuable to have these conversations though, because yeah, like you said, like these workers are being pitted against each other as their reasons for, the struggles that they're facing, and I think it's important to try to cut through that, definitely.
Yeah, no, it's I don't know, it's really terrible to see that, but I because everything's kept so segregated and so apart, I don't really, I don't know, I don't really know how you'd begin bringing everyone together without, I mean, clearly it'd be a great deal of effort, but I don't know, I wish I had a better answer for that, but I don't.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, that's okay. Like, we don't have to have all the answers, and I don't have the answers, and yeah, I think it's just important to ask the questions. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on Jason Kenney's platform. It's been it's quite long, but there are a few labor changes up there, especially including the changes to overtime. And I'm curious as to how that would impact work up there.
That impacts me directly because I've been through that. Going back to what I was talking about when like our union had to negotiate having flush toilets, with any kind of like union negotiation, like you've got to give stuff up, and both sides have to. So if something like the guaranteed time and a half was provincial law rather than something that we had to negotiate, maybe we wouldn't have had to put toilets on the line. So the more, I guess the more stuff like that can just be like enshrined into law, the more you can make bigger asks, and you don't have to spend all your capital just asking for, basic dignity. I don't know. That's very frustrating to see. And like, I don't know, even like the union people that I know now that do support the Conservatives, and I mean, there are lots, I'm not going to pretend that, but like, they seem to think that like something like that won't affect them because, most unions have it built in, the time and a half. So they're like, okay, well, that's not going to affect me. I'm going to get that regardless. But it does, because you're giving up something else for that, something that should just be law that you get automatically.
Is there anything that you want to share that we didn't get to talk about in the other questions? Any final thoughts or comments? Or
it goes back to what we were just talking about with the UCP and their platform and their changes to, so they want to change how unions are formed, basically weakening provisions for setting up a union. And I think I said a little earlier that for the most part of my career, I didn't work union, and I bought in all the anti-union hype that you hear in Alberta all the time. And one thing that's just always, it's like eaten at me for years, is that I worked at one of the largest non-union construction projects in Alberta, and there was a vote to unionize. And because of how the system is set up, is that it's not the card check system where it's just like, if enough people agree to it over time, then you can do it. It has to be done at a vote. And because it's done as a vote, my employer got to spend every morning during our safety meeting giving us an anti-union spiel. I genuinely think that if we had this card system in place at the time, we would have unionized. And I would have been against it at first, but it would have changed my mind pretty quickly once I realized that everything that I had been fed was wrong. But literally, we were being given false information about what unions did, and we were being told that you're going to lose your job and they're just going to bring in the union place. All of that's false. But when you're being fed this every single day and then being made to put to a vote, there's no wonder that it failed. But that's one of the parts of the platform that really irritate me, because I think, I don't know, I wish that other system was in place back when we went through that, so former me making the wrong decision still wouldn't have tanked a potentially very good thing.
that was Robert Lee, industrial electrician and oilfield automation programmer from Blackie, Alberta. To learn more, I've linked to several articles referenced in this episode in the show notes. You can also go back and listen to previous episodes exploring Indigenous and migrant workers in the oil sands. And if you're interested in initiatives to build solidarity with migrant and non-migrant workers, reach out to Migrante Alberta at migrantealberta.ca. You've been listening to Rank and File Radio Prairie Edition on CKUW 95.9 FM, Canadian labour news and analysis across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. This show is supported by CKUW listeners, UFCW Local 832, and Patreon supporters like Bronwyn, Buck, Christine, and Trevor. Thanks for keeping the show going. Subscribe to Rank and File Radio on iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Stitcher. And don't forget to check out RankandFile.ca for labour news and analysis across Canada. This is Emily signing off. I'll see you next week.